They laughed at humans. Until he stood up. The first laugh came from the back of the glass room, soft enough to be polite and cruel enough to be heard. Alexander Whitmore did not turn toward it. Men in rooms like this laughed all the time. They laughed when someone weaker objected, when numbers frightened a lesser board, when a local counselor used words like heritage and stewardship in front of people who measured the world in acquisition windows and return curves. Laughter, in Alexander's experience, was often just the cheapest sound power made before it signed a document. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Blackwood Estate, 7,400 acres of managed parkland, grazing ground, tenant cottages, ornamental lakes, and beyond the old stone boundary wall, a body of ancient woodland whose title deeds had become the center of the morning's argument. Rain tracked pale lines down the glass. Far beyond the terrace, the forest stood under a low Northumberland sky, dark and tight and old enough to make the modern wings of Whitmore House look temporary. "The development corridor is less than 5% of the total estate," said Hugh Marison, lead counsel, fingers resting on a leather folder that probably cost more than a month of rent in the village below. "A research campus, a private access road, and a controlled extraction program for fungal compounds with pharmaceutical value. Entirely lawful." "Entirely lawful according to whom?" asked Eleanor Graves. That drew the second laugh. She was seated alone at the far side of the long table, wearing a dark wool coat gone silver at the cuffs, a clean but mended blouse, and boots still carrying a line of dried mud around the soles. She had no glossy folder, no watch worth remarking on, no assistant at her shoulder. Her notes were written by hand. Rain had darkened one sleeve, and she had folded it back without embarrassment. She looked, Alexander thought, as if the room had been designed to exclude her and had failed. "According to title law, planning law, and the paperwork you've already received," Marison replied. Eleanor lifted her gaze from the handwritten pages. "No, I mean according to whom morally, according to whom ecologically, according to whom historically. Blackwood isn't a field you pave because a billionaire got bored with biotech and decided trees should start earning their keep." A few of the investors smiled. One outright smirked. Alexander rose. It was not dramatic. He simply placed both palms on the polished oak table and stood, and the sound in the room died with such speed that even the rain seemed to hesitate. He was 45, broad-shouldered, exact in everything. His charcoal suit had been cut in Seville row to fall as cleanly as poured ink. The platinum watch at his wrist caught a pale seam of light from the window. His cuff links carried the Whitmore crest, a hawk over crossed keys, small signals of old authority layered over new money. When he moved, people usually made room before they understood why. "I was born in a 2-bedroom terrace in Leeds," he said, voice calm. "My father repaired boilers. My mother worked nights. Do not talk to me about rich men getting bored, Ms. Graves. I built what I own." Eleanor did not blink. "And now you think that entitles you to own everything else." The room held. That should have been the end of it. Alexander could have left the response to council, signed the authorizations, and let the estate office bury the objections under procedure. Instead, he looked beyond Eleanor to the rain-thick window, to the line where the clipped lawns ended and the forest began. The trees seemed closer than they had looked an hour earlier, though that was impossible. "I think," he said, "that this woodland has been sentimentalized into paralysis." "It has been warned into patience," Eleanor said. "That is not the same thing." Afterward, when the investors had gone and the legal team descended to the drawing room for whiskey, Alexander remained alone in the conference chamber. Below, the village of Blackwood Fold sat in the valley with its slate roofs and narrow roads and one shuttered pub that his redevelopment plan intended to reopen for visiting executives. Beyond it, tenant cottages leaned into the weather. Stone walls crossed wet fields like old scars. On the terrace, his driver waited beside a black Rolls-Royce Phantom polished to a mirror sheen despite the rain. The car looked absurd against the country around it, as if London had taken a wrong turn into a folk tale. A knock came at the door. Marcus Reed stepped in. Former Royal Marines. Security chief. Expensive in the useful way, not the decorative one. He wore a dark field jacket instead of a suit and carried Rain on his shoulders. Perimeter team did a sweep, Marcus said. All clear. Alexander nodded. Marcus hesitated. Forestry men are asking whether you want them to start at first light or wait for the London consultants. First light. Marcus glanced toward the forest. The villagers won't like it. I didn't buy the estate to be liked. No, sir. Marcus did not move. Alexander knew that pause. It meant Marcus had something to say and disliked saying it in a house where the walls sometimes carried sound farther than expected. What? The locals say the inner wood isn't right after heavy rain. Alexander turned. Not right. Paths change. Fences disappear. Machinery doesn't hold calibration. Old stories. Alexander's mouth almost curved. And you? I think old stories usually start when somebody notices a pattern before they can explain it. That is a beautifully careful sentence, Marcus. It's raining hard enough to justify caution. Alexander walked to the window. Up close the glass reflected his own image over the land. Tailored shoulders, controlled mouth, pale eyes that did not give much away. Beyond that ghost, the forest waited. Blackwood. The legal maps identified compartments, access points, crown density, species distribution. But from the house the whole would look singular, knitted together by shade and wet bark and the kind of age that ignored maps. First light, he said again. Marcus gave a small nod. Yes, sir. That evening Alexander dressed for dinner, though there was no one to impress. Old habits were often the most expensive possessions a man owned. He changed into a black dinner jacket, a white shirt so crisp it seemed to make a point, and softer shoes that whispered on the corridors of Whitmore House. The estate had belonged to 3 declining aristocratic families before debt and taxes and time fed it to the market. He had bought it in a single quarter. He liked the arithmetic of that. The dining room was too large for one man, so he ate in the library. Roast pheasant, celeriac puree, a bottle of Bordeaux that had traveled farther and aged in better conditions than most people in Blackwood Fold ever would. The room smelled of beeswax, leather, wet stone from the hearth, and the faint mineral tang that old country houses developed when rain pressed against every window at once. He had just set down his glass when the lights dimmed. Only for a second. Then they steadied. Alexander looked up. The generator should have caught any fluctuation before the bulbs even thought of it. He stood, crossed to the control panel inset near the door, and saw that every system remained green. A reflection moved in the dark pane opposite him. He turned. Nothing inside the room. Outside, beyond the terrace doors, fog had climbed out of the lower grounds and spread itself over the lawn. It sat low at first, no higher than a man's knee, then thickened as he watched, whitening the clipped grass and swallowing the stone balustrade inch by inch. At the far edge, where the ornamental gardens gave way to rougher land, something made a sharp metallic sound. His phone vibrated. Marcus. Alexander answered. What was that? A pause. Rain hissed in the background at Marcus's end. Sir, one of the ground lights near the east path just failed. Why metallic? Because the pole is bent. By what? Another pause. You should come see. Alexander disliked invitations to witness anything that ought to have been resolved before it reached him. But there was something in Marcus's tone. Not fear exactly, but the disciplined edge of a man unwilling to jump to a conclusion and already disliking the alternatives. He took a coat instead of the dinner jacket, stepped into boots not nearly as expensive as the polished shoes waiting by the door, and went out. Rain struck cold across his face. The estate lights turned the mist into sheets of pearl. At the east path, 3 security men stood by a low lamp standard that had been installed only 6 months earlier during his refurbishment of the grounds. The steel pole leaned at an impossible angle. At its base, half buried in wet earth, a root as thick as a man's thigh had risen through the gravel and pressed the metal upward from below. Marcus shone a torch along it. The bark glistened black with rain. How old is that root? Alexander asked. The nearest groundsman, a wiry local named Peter Sayer, let out a humorless breath. Older than your house extension, I'd wager. You're telling me this came up tonight. Peter crouched, thumbed the split gravel, and held up fresh pale stone still dry on one side where the root had forced through. I'm telling you it wasn't here when I checked the path at 4. Alexander followed the root with his eyes. It disappeared into the fog toward the outer grounds, toward the boundary wall, toward Blackwood. Cut it out in the morning, he said. Peter did not answer quickly enough. Alexander looked at him. Problem? It'll grow back. Then we cut it again. Peter straightened, rain running from the brim of his cap. You can do that. It was the tone, not the words, that irritated Alexander. The soft rural fatalism. The suggestion that effort itself might be naive. He had spent too much of his life proving that to be nonsense. First light, he said, and turned back toward the house. Behind him, from somewhere in the fog, a sound rose clear and brief. Perfect electronic chime. The startup tone of one of Whitmore Dynamics' field tablets. Then silence. By 6 the next morning the rain had passed, but the estate looked as though it had been left overnight at the bottom of a gray sea. Water clung to every hedge and stone. Crows stood on the paddock fences like punctuation marks. The sun, when it finally bled through the cloud, had the weak metallic color of old coins. Alexander took coffee in the West Hall while James Holloway set up the survey screens in what had once been the music room. James was brilliant, narrow, perpetually underslept, and dressed as though comfort were a private rebellion against the clients who paid him. His jumper was frayed at one cuff. His boots carried machine oil. He adored systems because they usually behaved. LiDAR drones ready, James said without looking up. Soil resonance kit calibrated. Ground penetration mapping at 97%. 97. One sensor keeps drifting. Replace it. I have. Twice. Alexander set down the porcelain cup. And James finally looked at him. And I'd like to get a baseline reading outside before I tell you whether the problem is the sensor or the ground. By 8 the convoy stood at the Eastern Service Yard. 2 matte black utility vehicles, a low trailer carrying drilling components, 3 drones resting like folded insects in their cradles, and a cluster of workers in bright waterproofs that made the old stone walls around them look even older. Marcus moved among them, checking routes. Peter Sayer smoked by the gate. He ground the cigarette beneath his boot when he saw Alexander and gave the smallest nod required by employment. Eleanor was waiting there too. Of course she was. She had no high-vis jacket, no radio, no hard hat, just the same dark coat, a satchel, and a thermos tucked beneath one arm. She looked like she had walked through half the village to get here and had not minded the weather. You're trespassing on operational ground, Marcus told her. It's a public footpath for another 50 yards, she said. I'm still in love with the law, Mr. Reed, even when your employer isn't. Alexander approached. You do like theatrics. I like witnesses, Eleanor replied. Her gaze moved over the equipment, the drones, the polished vehicles, then flicked down to the valley road where an old farm truck rattled past with a blue tarpaulin tied over the back. Helps when one side arrives with enough money to drown the other. My side arrives with permits. You keep saying that as if paper impresses root systems. James, kneeling by a sensor case, made the mistake of snorting. He disguised it as a cough too late. Alexander ignored him. You think a forest is making legal arguments now? I think, Eleanor said, that people have been trying to tell you you're not dealing with timber volume and fungal compounds. You're dealing with an old living system that doesn't react well to force. Systems react to inputs. Her expression did not change. Exactly. The first drone lifted at 8:13. Its rotors shaved the damp air to a high whine as it rose above the boundary wall and skimmed over the first rank of beeches. James watched the live feed. Trunks silvered with lichen, dense undergrowth, a tangle of old paths half erased by leaf mold and time. Thermal's odd, he muttered. What does odd mean? Alexander asked. Means patches are cooler than open ground should be and warmer than shaded ground should be. Means I want another pass. He launched the second drone. For 12 minutes everything behaved. Then the first feed shivered. Pixelation rippled across the lower half of the screen. The camera dipped, corrected, spun slightly. James frowned and tapped commands across the tablet. The drone should have climbed. Instead it descended. "What are you doing?" Alexander asked. "Not me." The screen cleared for one sharp instant. A root plate filled the frame, vast, ridged, black with old moisture, though the drone had been flying well above the canopy line. Then branches swung upward as if the forest floor had risen to meet it. Signal lost. James swore softly, launched the third drone, and sent it straight up to maximum safe altitude before angling down over the same coordinate. The second feed held just long enough to show something snagged high between limbs. The missing drone, not smashed, not fallen, held. A net of pale threads stretched between three branches, taut and gleaming in the weak sun. Not spider silk, not rope, something fibrous, fungal, plant-like. The machine hung inside it, rotors twitching uselessly. Peter Sayer muttered, "Christ." James went very still. That wasn't there on satellite imagery. "Because satellite imagery wasn't taken this morning," Eleanor said. Alexander looked at her sharply. "You knew this would happen? I knew you would call whatever happened impossible right up until you ran out of other words." He had Marcus send 2 men in through the old keeper's path to retrieve the drone. They returned 48 minutes later without it. The path doubled back. One said, face gray beneath the hard hat. "Not on the map. We reached the Hawthorne marker twice." "You got lost 100 yards in?" The man swallowed. "No, sir. That's the problem." Alexander went in himself. He did not do it to prove courage. Courage was a poor substitute for control. He did it because information degraded as it passed through frightened people, and because the expression on Eleanor's face when he said he was going, something between warning and tired recognition, annoyed him enough to make withdrawal feel like surrender. Marcus insisted on accompanying him. So did James, because the drifting sensor had become an insult. Peter came because he knew the old paths. Eleanor came because when Marcus tried to stop her, she said, "If he's going to put a hole in the wood, someone should at least understand what it's saying back." The forest swallowed the estate almost immediately. One step beyond the boundary wall, sound changed. The open country's broad, wet hush narrowed into drips, leaf friction, the soft collapse of soaked loam under boots. The air smelled of mushrooms, green rot, iron-rich water, and something sweeter threaded through it all. Sap opened somewhere unseen. Light thinned into green-gray ribbons. Trunks rose close and straight, then bent away in shapes that made distance difficult to judge. Nothing in Alexander's houses, laboratories, cars, or boardrooms smelled remotely like this. The place seemed to have been fermenting for centuries. James stopped after 20 yards and checked the handheld unit. "Signal's worse in here. Because of canopy cover?" Alexander asked. "Maybe." Eleanor touched the mossed bark of a leaning oak as she passed it, almost absently, like a person brushing fingers over a familiar sleeve. "Maybe not." Peter led them past a fallen yew split by age into 2 living halves. "There ought to be a deer track off to the left," he said. "If the old path still runs." "Still," Alexander repeated. Peter looked back. "This would moves by inches, not by miles." "That's enough." Alexander nearly told him not to indulge superstition. Then he saw James staring at the ground. Roots crossed the path in wet black cords, dozens of them, close-packed and slick. Nothing remarkable about roots. What was remarkable was the fresh brightness where one had lifted through the leaf mold, exposing pale inner wood as if it had surfaced recently. Very recently. James crouched. "This one wasn't exposed 10 minutes ago. You marked it." "I'm telling you, the soil crust is still falling off." Marcus scanned the trees. "Keep moving." They found the drone where the feed had shown it, but the net holding it had changed. The pale fibers now wrapped the body in layered strands that looked less woven than grown. James reached out with a gloved hand and touched one. It clung briefly before peeling away, sticky and cold. "Fungal hyphae?" he said. Eleanor peered closer. Maybe a plant-fungal association. That formed in under an hour?" She looked at him. "Would that improve your day if I said no?" James straightened. "We need a sample." Alexander was about to agree when a sound came from somewhere behind them. A short electronic trill. Everyone froze. James slowly turned the tablet in his hands toward his face. The device was dark. No alert. The trill came again, this time farther left, then repeated once from deeper in the trees. Marcus swore under his breath. That's the drone recall tone. Peter had gone pale. That weren't no bird. No, Eleanor said quietly. Not a bird. Alexander felt, for the first time that morning, something colder than irritation moving under his ribs. James cut the drone free and they turned back. The walk out took longer than the walk in, though Peter insisted he was following the same route. Twice they reached landmarks none of them remembered passing. A hollow ash blackened inside by some ancient strike, a ring of stones consumed by roots until they looked like teeth inside a gum line of moss. James's handheld lost calibration entirely and began drawing overlapping lines that turned their retreat into a scribbled knot. Marcus used ribbon markers. 20 minutes later they found one already tied to a branch ahead of them. That's impossible, Marcus said. No, Eleanor answered. It's just inconvenient. By the time they emerged at the boundary wall, Alexander's coat hem was wet to the knee, mud had dried in a dull line up one trouser leg, and the expensive leather of his gloves was stained with something dark and resinous from a low branch he did not remember touching. He stripped the gloves off as though the material itself had offended him. We proceed with mechanical clearing, he said. Marcus glanced at him. After that. Especially after that. The first cutter went in at noon. It was a tracked forestry machine fitted with a hydraulic mulching head, the sort of equipment that reduced scrub and saplings to shredded compliance. From the yard, its paint shone immaculate yellow. By 12:31 it had chewed a corridor 10 meters into the undergrowth. By 12:44 it stopped. Not engine failure. Not driver error. The machine simply refused forward motion. The track spun, bit, spat wet earth, and screamed against buried resistance. Marcus ordered a halt and sent Peter in on foot to inspect the jam. Peter returned without his cap. Roots through the left drive assembly, he said. That's not possible, James said automatically, then shut his mouth. Marcus signaled for the maintenance kit. Alexander stepped forward himself. The root had entered through an opening barely wider than a fist and then expanded inside the housing, bowing steel outward. Fresh sap gleamed where the cutter head had severed a tangle of vine growth. The smell was sharp, almost medicinal. Alexander touched the deformed metal. It was warm. From somewhere inside the wood came the recall trill again. Then, impossibly, a second sound layered over it. A voice fragment. Thin, distorted, but unmistakable. Proceed. His own voice, repeating the command he had given 2 minutes earlier. No one spoke for several seconds. Eleanor watched the tree line with an expression that was not triumph but confirmation. The kind a doctor might where hearing a symptom they had warned about long before the patient arrived in pain. Stop the operation, she said. Alexander looked at the root inside his machine, the black wet forest beyond it, the men waiting for his order. He thought of the investors in London, the legal costs already sunk, the compounds in the fungal assays, the future campus, the interviews he had given about rural revitalization, the years of being the man who never reversed once the line was drawn. Double the lighting tonight, he said. No one enters the wood after dusk. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, as if some final private hope had just been wasted. That night Blackwood Estate gleamed like a ship preparing to cross hostile water. Marcus positioned portable flood units across the eastern lawns. Generator trailers hummed by the carriage house. Security cameras covered every approach. James moved the recovered drone to the music room and stripped its casing piece by piece, searching for contamination, sabotage, explanation. Peter refused the overtime envelope Alexander offered and went home to the village before dark. Eleanor did not leave. She sat in the old servants' hall with tea gone cold, reading through copies of estate maps and 17th-century surveys as if the dead might yet prove more useful than the living. Alexander watched all of it from the upper gallery outside the library. He had changed again. Fresh shirt, dark cashmere, shoes polished by habit, and the effort now felt faintly absurd. as though he were dressing a mannequin for a negotiation the room itself had stopped believing in. He could smell expensive cologne at his own collar and damp earth coming through the cracked stone around the windows. One of those scents had traveled from Mayfair. The other had traveled from the Treeline 50 yards away and would remain after the house, the gallery, and every polished shoe he owned had become archaeological trivia. He despised the thought. At 21:08, the east cameras went down. All 6 at once. James looked up from the drone parts spread across the long table. That's not power loss. It's feed corruption. Meaning the systems are still on. They're just receiving nonsense. The monitors filled with static, then with brief looping fragments of their own earlier footage. Marcus crossing the lawn in late afternoon, a floodlight being positioned, Alexander stepping into frame and out again. Each loop shortened on every repeat until the figures jerked like badly remembered gestures. Then a new image appeared. Not a feed. Pattern. Concentric thermal rings pulsing outward on the site map from the eastern boundary wall, expanding through the lawns toward the house. James went pale. That's from the soil resonance array. It isn't even connected to the CCTV grid. How far? Marcus asked. James swallowed. Moving at about. He checked, then checked again. 8 centimeters a minute. Marcus turned to the window. Outside, the nearest floodlight flickered. A second later, the lawn beyond it lifted. Not dramatically, not like a film. No earth explosion. No violent break. The ground simply rose along a low dark seam as a root thick as a man's torso pressed upward beneath the soaked turf and traveled forward in a straight patient line toward the lights. One by one, the portable units leaned and died. Their white beams cut sideways through the mist before vanishing. Someone in the corridor cursed. Alexander was already moving. By the time he reached the east doors, Marcus had 4 men in waterproofs and helmets forming at the terrace steps. James arrived behind them clutching a tablet he was no longer pretending to trust. Eleanor came last, coat thrown over one shoulder, hair loose from its knot, face drained but steady. No machines, she said. Alexander did not look at her. This is my house. No, Eleanor said. This is a question. You are about to answer it badly. The root crossed the lower lawn with sickening grace, not fast, not slow, carrying a ridge of torn grass ahead of it like the wake of a boat. Smaller roots surfaced with it, branching outward. They did not writhe. They aligned. Marcus spoke quietly into his radio. Nobody steps past the stone line. The men held position. The main route reached the first terrace step and stopped. Rainwater dripped from the balustrade. Wind moved faintly through the yews. Somewhere in the dark to the east, beyond the extinguished lights, a shape rustled high in the trees. The sound that followed came from the terrace speakers. Not from the house system, they were disconnected. Not from any visible device. A crisp synthetic chime rang out across the lawn. Whitmore Dynamics startup tone. It was followed by a voice fragment. Double the lighting tonight. Alexander's own voice again, clean and clear, replayed into the wet dark. A second voice answered from farther away, carried thin and sharp through the trees. Stop the operation. Eleanor. The men at the steps turned toward her involuntarily. Marcus did not. His eyes stayed on the root at the stone line. James looked ready to be ill. How is it doing that? No one replied. Then the drone on the table inside the music room powered itself on. They all heard it. Rotors twitching, internal fan whining. The bright sequence of boot-up notes cutting through the open doors behind them. James spun. I pulled the battery. The sound died. At the stone line, a second root surfaced and traced the edge of the terrace without crossing it. Eleanor stepped past Alexander. Marcus moved to stop her, but she lifted a hand and he froze, perhaps because there was something in her face that made interruption feel indecent. She descended the first step and stood 2 yards from the root. Rain darkened her coat. Mud marked the hem. Against the light from the house she looked small, underdressed, underfunded, utterly outmatched by every metric Alexander usually trusted. Yet she was the only person there who did not seem diminished. You've made your point, she said into the dark. Nothing moved. Eleanor glanced back once, directly at Alexander. Tell it. The absurdity of that struck him first. Tell it. As if he were in negotiations with a woodland. As if roots and mold and signal corruption had assembled not a threat but an argument. He almost refused on principle. Then the terrace stone gave a dry crack. A hairline split opened beside his left shoe, and from it emerged the tip of a pale shoot, blind and wet and urgent. It rose another inch while he watched. Something inside him, long-armored and expensive, finally understood that mockery was no longer an available response. He stepped forward. Rain touched his face. The cold smelled of leaves and old water and broken things healing in the dark. I was wrong, he said. The words landed badly in his own ears. Too clipped. Too managerial. He forced himself to try again. I came here to take from a system I did not understand. I called it underused because I did not know how to value what I could not own. The wind moved once through the trees. James stared at him as if he had begun speaking another language. Perhaps he had. Alexander looked past the root line into the black-layered wood. He thought of the terrace in Leeds where damp crept up wallpaper every winter and his mother still polished the one brass clock in the house because making something shine was how she fought humiliation. He thought of the first suit he bought for a bank interview, cheap enough to shine at the elbows in 6 months. He thought of the years between then and now spent converting vulnerability into armor so efficiently that he had forgotten armor was not the same thing as wisdom. I will withdraw, he said. No road, no campus, no extraction, no machines. The root at the step did not move. Eleanor did not look away from the dark. And the legal pressure? Alexander swallowed rain. Gone. And the villagers' access? Restored. She waited. There it was again. That intolerable, necessary waiting. The refusal to let him buy absolution with broad statements. The estate trust will transfer the inner wood into permanent local stewardship, he said. You can draft the structure. Not me. Now the silence changed. Not broken. Deepened. From the trees came a rustle like 1,000 sleeves drawn across bark. The main root slowly, almost courteously, withdrew a fraction from the stone line. Around it, the smaller branching roots settled back into the lawn. Not retreating, resetting. A boundary re-established by something older than title deeds. James made a sound halfway between a laugh and a gasp. Marcus lowered the radio from his mouth. High above them, unseen in the wet branches, something mimicked the click of a camera shutter. Then the startup chime sounded one last time, distant and amused, and was gone. No one slept much. By dawn the lawn looked almost normal except for the broken lights, the torn strips of turf, and the single pale shoot still standing from the crack in the terrace stone. Alexander found it there when he came down before sunrise, wearing yesterday's trousers and no tie, his face rough with a night that had not improved him. The shoot had opened the faintest green tip. He crouched and touched the stone beside it, not the living thing itself. In the east, mist lay low over the fields. Sheep moved like scraps of cloud between walls. Somewhere beyond the gardens a church bell from Blackwood Fold marked 6 in a tired bronze note. Eleanor joined him carrying 2 mugs of tea. He took one. I don't like owing lessons to people who were right. A corner of her mouth moved. That's because you're rich. You're used to buying them wholesale and calling it strategy. He gave a breath that might have become a laugh in a different life. They stood in silence. Behind them Whitmore House rose with all its imported stone, its mirrored halls, its paintings insured for obscene amounts, its cellar lined with wines that expected another century. Ahead lay the village with its patched roofs and narrow budgets and families who measured winter in fuel deliveries rather than investment cycles. Between them, and around them all, Blackwood waited in the damp morning light like a thought too old to hurry. The board fought him, of course. In London, 3 directors called him irrational within the first 7 minutes of the emergency meeting. One accused him of yielding to rural activism and anecdotal sabotage. Another asked whether he had suffered some form of breakdown in isolation. Hugh Marrison outlined very carefully how much money withdrawal would cost. Alexander listened until they finished. Then he stood. Again the room quieted. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "We are not building there," he said. "We are not litigating local access. We are not contesting stewardship. You can classify that as moral clarity, strategic reallocation, or self-preservation according to the vocabulary that helps you sleep. But understand this clearly. There are systems in this world that do not recognize our categories of ownership. We approached one as if wealth were a language it would naturally speak. It is not." One director actually laughed, disbelieving, and Alexander felt the strange detached sensation of watching history repeat at a cheaper scale. "They laughed at humans," he said quietly, more to himself than to them, "because they thought humanity's oldest talent was force." He ended the meeting before anyone could answer. 3 weeks later, under a sky the color of brushed pewter, Blackwood Trust was signed in the village hall. The papers were ordinary. The room smelled of instant coffee, damp coats, and old varnish. Eleanor signed in blue ink. Peter Sayer witnessed with hands scrubbed raw and nails still dark at the edges from a life no manicure would ever understand. Children ran in the corridor outside. Someone had brought supermarket biscuits on a paper plate. No one wore anything remotely worth insuring. Alexander signed last. When it was done, he walked alone to the boundary wall. The wood beyond stood bare-branched now in the first edge of winter, every trunk visible, every depth between them somehow less knowable for the clarity. A robin landed on the wall 2 feet from his hand and tilted its head. Tiny, round, ordinary. Then it made a sound. A perfect imitation of the click of his expensive watch clasp closing. Alexander smiled despite himself. "I understand," he said. The robin flew into Blackwood. The branches received it without comment. He remained there a long while, a rich man in a dark coat beside an old wall, looking into a forest that could not be bought, had never needed him, and had still allowed him the dignity of leaving wiser than he arrived.